glad that you're here, especially our guests that are here today. I want to begin with an invocation / blessing. When our kids were small and it was like too difficult to have like a blessing before you ate, we just slip it in the middle of meals. That's kind of what we're doing here today. So let me ask you to bow your heads for a word of prayer. Oh, great God of heaven, oh Lord of love, we thank you for this day and for your presence among us. We thank you for this meal and for your blessings upon those who made it for us. And now, come and be among us in our conversation and show us your way and give us your insights into your hope. Amen. As we begin, I want to introduce Carol Tiller. Carol, where are you? There you are. Carol, come up. Carol has information about a legislative initiative on housing that our women's group called United Women of Faith, which is formerly known as United Methodist Women, are doing statewide. So, Carol, explain to them.
Thank you. Yes. Because I'm a board member for the Indiana Conference of United Women in Faith, so their issues also go right along with North churches. Stare very much. And reason why is that, just think about this, 98,000 children in the state of Indiana are affected by evictions. Did you hear that? 98,000. And Indianapolis has the highest rate of evictions. So Marion County averaging 400 to 600 every week for that. So what it is that we're trying to get legislation that would have an escrow account. So right now, somebody could be renting and they could have no heat in December. They could be no water, whatever. They still are obligated to pay rent. And if they don't, then they get eviction, and that goes on their record, and it's hard for them to be able to get another place to rent. And so what we're trying to do is have developed an escrow account. So they still would pay towards it, but the landlord would not get the money until they made the repairs. Because just think of living in December or January here and not having heat or having mold or whatever the other issues are for this. So this is so we are joining with the United Women in Faith and just saying that and we're asked to contact your state senator. So if you do not know it, your state senator, I can get on the phone, or you can my laptop, whatever, that if you can write it personally to say, like for instance in this area right here, it's Frank Taylor. So we don't want Senator Braun or Young at national, we want the state. This is what we want for Indiana. So we have that. You put your name and address, and if you don't know your senator by your address, we can then look it up for you and find out who. And the church is going to be taking care of mailing these all to the state senators. So if you have any questions, let me know. So before you leave, we're going to give you a paper.
Great. So the letters will be available for you, and you can get them from Carol, and we'll collect all of those and bundle them and send them to each representative. We are pleased to have as our keynote speaker, Fran Quigley. Fran, as several of you know, is a clinical professor at the IU School of Law, McKinney School of Law here in Indianapolis, and the director of their Health and Human Rights at the law school. He's a graduate of IU Law School in Bloomington, graduate of Hanover College, and a graduate of Chittard here in Indianapolis. And I've known Fran over the years. The first time that we met would have been in the early 90s when I was the pastor at East 10th United Methodist Church on the Near East Side. And at that time, he was the chief of staff for Representative Carson. And there was a bank that closed. It was a bank of what? You know what? On 10th Street. And so those of us in the community had organized about that bank closing because it ran right through the Community Reinvestment Act issues of that day. Fran was very instrumental in helping the community in the advocacy of that. So we go back far enough that at least I had hair. So it goes back that far. So we're very pleased to have Fran with us. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Pastor Darren. Yeah, flowing dark hair. I have bangs. I had a problem. So it's a great pleasure and privilege to be here today. As a lot of North parishioners I know are in the room, but not everybody is. And I know, just in case you don't know, that North Church has a very strong and ongoing commitment to the housing insecure in our community, including our community very much defined right around where the church grounds are. I live actually not too far south of here, so I know and appreciate everything North does, and I know there's more plans to do even more, so it's a privilege to be here to talk about housing with all of you. And I'm also excited to sit and hopefully mostly listen to the panel discussion, because I'll have my say before that. Reverend Edgar has an amazing story to tell about what they've been doing in Columbus and how that model is spreading around the country. David Bacon and John Hamilton both have their own housing expertise and have a lot to share with you all, which is a different kind of expertise, frankly, than I have to share with you. And there's a lot of wisdom in this room, and at risk of embarrassing a few people, I want to ask if I'm going to ask a few folks to raise your hands just so afterwards you know where the expertise is. So I think we have both Rabbi Aaron Spiegel and Carolyn Kingen of the Eviction Justice Network in the kind of middle there. We'll talk about what they do and how all of us can be a part of what they do. I saw Keith Bavakwa come in, who works with homeless youth to get them connected to education. Downs, who works with the immigrant community and has, and obviously lots of housing challenges and other challenges she works with them on. Jeremy Werner is back here. He's a subject matter expertise, and he actually, I think, has a placard. A couple of you have placards, right, to say for the challenges of persons living with disabilities and finding affordable and accessible housing. Lisa Cole with Home Repairs for Good, which helps with home repairs for seniors and persons living with disabilities who are trying to stay in their own homes but need to fix them up and have the financial and logistical challenges there. So I am missing people, I know. I'm sorry about that. But you can get a feel that there is expertise in the room, and hopefully folks I haven't shouted out during the Q&A, you will not be shy and raise your hand and let people know what you know and what you have to offer everybody here. So, what do I have to offer everybody here? As Pastor Darren said, our law school clinic is actually called Health and Human Rights Clinic. And when we talk about that it's a human rights clinic, people think, oh, you're doing work in Haiti, or you're doing work in Somalia, or you're doing work in the Middle East. And we have done that kind of work in the past. But that's not what our focus is now. So what I want to do is share with you a story about a human rights violation. And this human rights violation occurred just a few miles away from here, and it occurred 6 days ago. 6 days ago. The human rights victim, this is not her real name, if she's a real person, I won't give her real name. I'm going to call her Angela Cooper. Angela is a mom with 3 boys. One of the boys has a serious developmental disability issue. It's been very difficult for her to find consistent, reliable care for him. As a result, she's missed work a few times. When she missed work enough times, had enough points taken off, she got fired. So she lost her full-time job. And she ended up doing part-time work. She worked part-time office cleaning in the hours that she could get childcare, and she was doing DoorDash and driving around sometimes with the kids in the car doing delivery. And that doesn't add up to much, but she was making it work. And I gotta say, with our clients who we see, it's amazing what people can do. But she was paying 70, 80, sometimes 90% of her income to make rent each month. And somehow making it work until she couldn't. A couple months ago, Angela's mom passed unexpectedly. And Angela took what money she had coming in, and she paid the funeral and burial expenses because that's what she needed to do. But as a result, she missed a car payment. She missed a car payment, she got her car repossessed. When she got her car repossessed, she couldn't get to the work, she got behind on her rent, landlord filed an eviction notice. And so we see her in court. And frankly, that's what we do. My students and I represent Angela and others every single week in a couple of different courts here in Marion County. And when Angela told her story in court, outside court, and to one of the students and me, she started crying. And you know what? We had tissues ready, because there's a lot of crying in eviction court. And it turns out that Angela's was actually one of 43 human rights violations that occurred just in that court last week. That's one of 10 courts in this county that evict people every week. There are dozens more human rights violations that occurred in a court that's 3.4 miles away from here. There's even more in a court that's 1.7 miles away from here. In fact, there are, and you already heard this, you heard this, that there are 500 eviction cases filed in Marion County, Indianapolis alone, every single week. 25,000 a year. And they're not numbers, they're people, they're families. They're like Angela. It's one of the highest rates in the country, as you already heard, and each one represents a very, very sad and tragic situation. So I think we could agree, I'm sure people who've come to a housing discussion on a Sunday afternoon agree these are sad situations, they're tragic even. But why do I call them human rights violations? Why do I put on this law professor hat and say these are human rights violations? Well, I call them that, and we call them that in our clinic, not just because housing is a human right is the law in virtually every nation in the world, which it is. And we call it that not just because most Americans, when we're polled, we believe that housing is a human right, which we do. I call it that because the technical definition about a human rights violation is that there's government involvement, right? In our housing system in the United States of America, and our housing system in Indianapolis, Indiana, is not a free market system. It is enormously government influenced at every deep stage of the process. And at the core of our housing system is a government-created injustice. So let's talk about that in the scene of where Angela came to court and where we go to court every week. If you look around in the court, and you've seen an eviction court, there's a couple of different actors there. There's a judge, there's lawyers for the landlords. Sometimes, and unfortunately in Marion County with some grant money for a little bit of time, we have lawyers that are helping tenants for free. Most courts around the state of Indiana don't have any lawyers for the tenants, but we do, including me. And you see the landlords themselves, the entities that are kicking people out of their homes. So guess in that group, and you see the tenants like Angela, by the hundreds in every single week. So you look around that room and see who has government subsidized housing. It's not who you think. Because if you look, let's look at the first group, and that's the lawyers and the judges. And my guess is maybe some of the folks in this room. So if you have a mortgage, or if you have had a mortgage, and that includes me, we have government subsidized housing. We have very generously government subsidized housing. Because in the United States, we give $63 billion in tax breaks to folks who own homes, mostly going to the very wealthiest people who own homes, sometimes multiple homes. So there's going to $63 billion a year in tax breaks because we're homeowners. We also, if we sell our homes, the tax law says, or United States law says, we can sell our homes and we can make up to $500,000 if we're a couple of value of that home and pay nothing in taxes. Nothing in taxes. And for most homes in the United States over the last 10 years, you can increase the value of $150,000. So the government also acts to insure our loans, that for many of us, at least our starting homes in particular, starting mortgages in particular. And also the government, the United States government has long since pushed for a 30-year fixed rate mortgage as the norm. Now this may seem for most of us in this room like, well, of course, but this is not the norm in other nations around the world. So what we have as homeowners, we benefit from these government subsidies with predictability of monthly housing costs. We know what we're going to pay. I know what I'm going to pay next month. I know what I'm going to pay next year. I know where I'm going to live next month. I know where I'm going to live next year. Our renter neighbors don't know that. And not to mention, I have the value, and we all of those who have a mortgage and have a home ownership status that's been supported by the government, we have benefited to the tune of enormous wealth building. And that wealth building, of course, lets us pass on to our children. Maybe we can help them buy a home, and they can benefit from this as well. Angela doesn't have access to any of this, and neither do other folks that are in that courtroom. So why in this picture, you see the picture, I did Google Images, right? I come up with a picture of the homeowners. Why is this a lily white family? It's a lily white family because that's what America looks like. That's what eviction court looks like. Almost all of the lawyers are white folks, and most of the judges are white folks. And that's true for what homeownership looks like. Almost 3 of every 4 families in white households own their home, and less than half of black households do. And what does that mean? That means not just the loss of security that we have with our homes that we own. It means the loss of wealth. For most U.S. families, our wealth is in our homes. And if a family doesn't own their own home, they don't have the ability to grow that wealth away. So the data come out that white families have 12 times more wealth than the average black family in the United States. 12 times as much. It ties directly back to the fact of who owns their home and who doesn't. And each year, what that means is that renters are very disproportionately persons of color. And what it means is that for the folks that we heard Carol talk about, the folks who are getting evicted each month and each week in Marion County and beyond, in the state of Indiana, beyond in the entire country, very disproportionately going to be children, and very disproportionately going to be black children. 1 of every 4 black children who live in a renter household, they had an eviction filing this year. And that means next year and the year after that. So why is that? Well, the one-word answer is racism, right? 2-word answer is government racism. And again, folks have written long books about this, and I don't want to give you the long treatise about that. But if you want a 20-minute read that's a survey of how the comprehensive and excellent review of the ongoing economic impact of centuries of racist government practices, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, in her dissenting opinion in the affirmative action case last year, a terrific survey that goes through the theft of black labor, not just from slavery, but then from sharecropping days, and then from excluding persons of color and the professions they're in from wage and hour protections. And then you look especially in housing, we have, with government funding, built the white middle class, right? After World War II, with low-cost loans that were not made available to persons of color. In fact, persons of color were excluded from those very neighborhoods. So we see that this is not an accident, and the government has been involved at every stage. So that's the lawyers, and that's the judges, and frankly, there's probably a lot of us in this room. What about other folks in that room, the landlords? It's important when you talk about landlords to recognize who we see in that courtroom, because we don't really see the folks who own the homes. Because the whole idea of a mom and pop landlord, that iconic mom and pop, is not really the case anymore. Research you see a little bit on the screen from Savvy Bayou, Indianapolis, from the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana, from the Indy Star, shows that we have an enormously increasing amount of corporate landlords in our community, and those are the ones that are quick to evict people. And I will say, and we have at least one judge in the room, so he can't say it, but I will say that the corporate landlords are the ones who have the worst conditions pretty consistently as well. So let's talk about those landlords for a second, because they don't show up in the courtroom. They got lawyers who are there for them. This is one who doesn't show up at the courtroom. His name's Stephen Ross. Stephen Ross is one of the 250 richest people in the entire world. Stephen Ross made $1.5 billion in real estate income over 10 years, paid nothing in federal taxes. 0. Now there's another famous real estate developer who I quote here. The feelings are still a little raw a few days after the election, right? But one of them who has been very clear, this is where he made his billions from day one, multi-generational billions. Donald J. Trump, who has been open about the fact that depreciation and all these tax breaks have been a way that he's built wealth and his family has built wealth. And the old saying in the tax lawyer business is, if you want to be rich but convince some people say you're poor, real estate is the business to be in. Because we spend 5 times as much in tax expenditures on these kind of folks, these kind of corporate landlords, billionaires, than we do on Angela and other people who need housing assistance. Because there's so much tax benefit, so many incentives, so many ability to fund the richest landlords in our country. And you know who figured that out? Stephen Ross. Because you know what he did before he was a developer? He was a tax lawyer. So I'm going to show you a slide we use in class. This is the worst PowerPoint slide ever, right? It's all this text and all these details and all this jargon. And I won't make you take a quiz. We do that with the students, right? We'll spend a week on this. But then I won't make you take a quiz. But to give you an idea, these are all the different benefits that wealthy landlords, especially private equity, corporate landlords, etc., get from our tax code, from our laws that our government has passed, and the subsidies that we provide. Again, it adds up to 5 times as much as we do for for low-income folks. This screen, as ugly as it is and text-filled as it is, this is government-subsidized housing. This is government-subsidized, but by far the most volume of government-subsidized housing we have in our nation. So, we've talked about the lawyers and the judges, which frankly we get the benefit, not as much as the corporate landlords, but we get some benefit. We talk about the corporate landlords. Is everybody in that courtroom getting government-subsidized housing? No. Because Angela isn't. And pretty much everybody that's lined up in that courtroom is not getting government-subsidized housing, because that's why they're in the courtroom, because they're paying 70, 80, 90% of their income on market rate rent. Now, it doesn't mean they're not eligible for government-subsidized housing. Angela is. Virtually every single client we ever have is eligible for government-subsidized housing, but we don't fund it enough. In fact, we play this very cruel musical chairs game. You see that image here? The musical chairs game is that only 1 out of every 4 families who are eligible for a Section 8 voucher or for public housing can get it. The rest are either on a wait list or on a wait list to be on the wait list or calling to get themselves put on the wait list. In fact, I had to doctor this image because you can't find an image online that has a musical chairs game this cruel where you have 4 people fighting over 1 chair. But that's what we do with housing. And you know, ironically, we don't do that for other benefits, other human necessities in our country. If you are eligible for food stamps, SNAP, we've got a lot of expertise in this room, you know. If you're eligible, you receive it. If you're eligible for Medicaid, you receive it. So, ironically, outside, oftentimes Judge Graves Court himself, but oftentimes there is somebody in a card table like these with a very colorful sign on it, and it's from a nonprofit that's funded by government dollars saying, hey, sign up for health insurance. Sign up for the Healthy Indiana Plan, sign up for Hoosier Healthwise. Why? Because they know the people in eviction court are eligible because they're too poor, they're poor enough that they are qualified. But also they're looking to sign up for health insurance the day they walk out of a courtroom where they've lost their housing because that program is not available to them. So, but the effect of that cruel musical chairs game, that's why we have 500 people losing their homes each week in Marion County. It's why we have 25,000 a year. It's why nationally there's 22.5 million people who are in households, census figures show, are behind on the rent now. For context, that is the population of Ohio and Pennsylvania combined. Or Pennsylvania and Illinois combined. That's what we have. And again, it's not an accident that we have a black family depicted, obviously this isn't Angela, and it's not an accident that we have a child depicted, because the most common demographic of who gets evicted is going to be a child. So, I know that it's very law professory of me to come up and give a lot of tax policy, but the reason is because I think Dr. King's statement that we have socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor, one phrase to describe our housing system, I think that's the best one. Still to this day in 2024. So this is a lot of pain that's going on, literally, you know, the block that we're on, the next block over, the next block over than that. And it's depressing stuff, but I won't leave you hanging with that. I want to give you 3 short-term answers and 3 long-term answers. And again, these are just my views of these, and we're going to have a panel of experts, and we have expertise in the room, so I'm looking forward to other folks providing their insight as well. But let me start with the short-term answers, evictions. Because it's really remarkable how much pain our clients endure. You just look at the data. Evictions and poor housing are linked to premature birth, low birth weight, difficulty in school, depression, suicide, hospitalization, and something called all-cause mortality. Don't have a public health expertise, but we know what all-cause mortality means, right? Translation is because of not being safely housed, people in our community and beyond are getting sick, and people are dying. And if you do this work long enough, you know that, and you have examples and stories that you could share with them. So, when you look at evictions, you look at Indiana, we already had the discussion about how Indiana, boy, we're like leading the nation in some measures. We are evicting so many people. Why is that? Well, on one side, it doesn't make sense because the struggle to get subsidized housing, that's a national struggle. And in Indianapolis, we have struggled for people to afford market rate housing, but it's actually cheaper than it is a lot of places. So why are we evicting so many people? The answer is because under Indiana law and the laws that have been written by legislators who have been dictated on those laws by, the corporate landlord lobby, is that we make evictions fast, we make them cheap, and we make them easy. Fast is that in Marion County, an eviction can happen as quickly as someone getting notice. Angela gets notice, she can have a court hearing 10 days later and lose her home that day. Outside of Marion County, it's faster. There are places in this state where people are getting notices and going to court the next day or 2 days later, 3 days later, and losing their homes. Now, fast, you talk about if anybody in our business, or if you've ever had a legal case, even if you're not an attorney or in the law business, you recognize, wait a minute, doesn't justice move really slowly? Yeah. If I want a trial for my contract case, get ready, you're waiting 1.5 years for that, right? If you've got an automobile accident case, if you've got a family law case, you're waiting a long time. Not evictions. The evictions, we move super fast to put people out of their homes. So that's what we do in Indiana in particular. We go fast. We make it cheap. Landlords, if they put a lie detector on, and sometimes out in the hallways, the landlord attorneys will confess to you, this is a really cheap collection tool. It costs $104 to file an eviction. And a whole lot of times you file the eviction, then the tenant will come up and they'll figure out a way to come up with the money. But when they do, the lease that's been written by the landlord also says, guess what? You're paying late fees. You're paying attorney's fees. You're paying court fees. Can't tell you how many times people come to court and they're like, I think I've caught up. It's like, no, you haven't, because there's $600, $700, $800 worth of attorney's fees and late fees and court fees added on because of the lease that they didn't write that they couldn't negotiate. So we make it fast, we make it cheap, and we make it easy. Most judges in Indiana, and we heard a little bit about this from Carol, is that most judges in Indiana, if Angela or somebody else comes to court and says, my home has been infested by bugs, I've got mold, I've got ceiling caving in, I've got rodents, I've got the front door is broken. Most judges in Indiana will say, are you current on your rent? And they'll say, no, but judge will stop. You're evicted. You can argue about that another day. Now, there are some judges in Indiana who will entertain the argument that that is a defense to not paying, but we need to make that much more clear in the law. So thank you for pushing to make that much more clear in the law. And we're still pushing on the lawyer side as well. So fast, cheap, and easy. What's the result of that? The Fair Housing Center has that quote up here. What we have done is create an environment that's catnip to the worst corporate landlord actors in the nation. They come to Indiana, why? Because they can evict people quickly. They come to Indiana, why? Because they do not have to have healthy conditions in the housing because tenants have trouble enforcing it. So what do we do? How do we change that? Here's 3 basic core guidance. One is to have safe, healthy housing and enforceable guarantees of that. As you heard, the Indiana law already says that its landlord has an obligation to provide safe, healthy housing that complies with local housing codes, but tenants can't enforce that. It's very difficult for tenants to enforce it. We need to change that with the escrow account would be a real important step in that direction. We need to have the presumption of lease renewal. We talk about what we benefit as homeowners. I know where I'm going to live next year. I know I'm going to live the year after that. I know that I'm safe in my home. If I'm leasing, the landlord doesn't have to renew my lease in Indiana. And oftentimes, frankly, if I call the Board of Health or if I complain to the landlord about the mold, guess what? They're not going to renew my lease. Sometimes the lease is a year. Sometimes it's month to month. A lot of times it's month to month. And so we talk with tenants all the time out there and live in some pretty bad conditions, but they're not quite ready to move, so they can't complain about it because they know the retaliation is coming if you don't protect that. We can. Other jurisdictions do that. We can have what's called a presumption of lease renewal. Sometimes it's called good cause eviction. And the courts simply need to treat evictions like we do with other life-shattering cases. There's a reason legal cases move more slowly, usually, right? They're important issues. They're complicated issues. There are human rights at stake. We move slowly, except we don't do that in evictions. We can do that. I can say that I was helped co-author an article that went in our State Bar Association magazine, and a student did most of the work, and another attorney and me worked along. But the working title, I can say, for that article was "Slow the F Down." We didn't use that as the actual title, because it did get published. So I'm not sure that would have happened otherwise. So we can just slow down, treat the these as the family-shattering events that they are. So that's number one. How do we fix this in terms of addressing this? I mentioned that Rabbi Aaron and Carolyn, and I'm missing other folks probably back there who are part of the Eviction Justice Network. Locally, there are people who are working on this and doing amazing work. They are actually going to eviction courts, they're observing eviction courts, they're reporting on eviction courts, they're meeting with judges, they're meeting with legislators, they're lobbying and trying to make the situation much better. And again, I'm going to ask you again for Aaron and Carolyn to raise your hands, and anybody else, is there anybody else I'm missing? If you want to be a part of fixing this is a real important step. Carolyn is a member of St. Luke's, or Brittany Street. Yeah, Methodist, right? The Housing Justice Task Force there. So Methodists are already doing this, already in courts, causing judges heartburn, causing landlord attorneys heartburn. So bless you for that work. There are various congregations that are going to court. They'll train you. They'll tell you where the court is. They'll tell you. And again, the first step is to just witness the injustice, right? And the next step is to advocate for that injustice to change. And they're doing both of those. So if you want to be involved, here's the website, and you can talk to those folks after. So that's number one. Slow down the government eviction machine. Number two is ending homelessness. This is sort of a longer conversation than we're going to have today. But this is a short-term answer, because we can do this. Other communities have proven that we can do this. The Housing First policy is that you provide unconditional permanent housing as quickly as possible to people, and then you provide supportive services that needed afterward. So in order to understand how Housing First works and literally ends long-term homelessness in cities across the country that have adopted this and followed through, you have to expose three different myths about the homeless. One is that the visible unhoused population is the majority. The folks that we see who are predominantly male, oftentimes with visible mental health issues, etc., that's what we think of as the homeless population. Majority is no, they're Angela. The people that we see in eviction court, because they're sleeping in their cars, or they're sleeping in a long-term hotel, and then they're going back to the car, or they're couch surfing with friends, or they're figuring out something, but they're not visibly downtown wandering the streets. And it's kids. It's kids. That's the majority of homeless, is a population like that. And the second, that addiction and mental illness are the main triggers of homelessness. Now, as you can imagine, being unhoused is not good for your mental health, right? Being unhoused is not good for avoiding addictive behaviors. And sometimes people do have mental health issues or addictions before they become unhoused. But a lot of people now, and a whole lot of people historically, with addictions and mental illness, were housed. That's not a prevention of actually being housed. It makes it harder, and of course, being unhoused makes it worse. So what you see is that the data show for every $100 increase in average rents, homelessness spikes by 9%. People are unhoused because they can't afford housing. And we see that again by the hundreds in eviction court every week here in our community across the country. And finally, the myth is that unhoused people don't want housing. That's certainly not what we hear. It's not what we see. Reverend Edgar kept preaching about that earlier today. People want a place to stay. The data show 99.6%, I want to say, of folks who are asked, they want permanent supportive housing. Now, they may not want to go to that shelter that's going to kick them out at 6 a.m. or make them go to religious services, or doesn't let their spouse be there or their support animal be there. But that doesn't mean they don't want to be housed. They do want housing with dignity. So we can end homelessness. There's all kinds of data showing that. There's all kinds of examples from cities across the country, Milwaukee, Denver, Houston, etc., that have proven that to be true. Third short-term answer is rent control. There's a really exciting movement going on now of tenant unions across the country. In Louisville, there's a really strong tenant union. Kansas City, Connecticut, Bozeman, Montana, etc. And they have a slogan, which you see on her t-shirt, "The rent is too damn high." Pretty pithy, right to the point, right? If the rent's too damn high, what are you going to do about it? We need to lower the rent, or at least control it. Rent control does that. We certainly don't have that in Indiana and Indianapolis, but it is common across the country. 180 cities have it, including the biggest cities in the country. The state of Oregon has it. And if we include rent control federally, we can look at the fact that, circling back to government involvement in housing, 40% of the rental housing in this country has federal subsidies to it. The federal financing. We've been giving that financing. I think Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac gave $142 billion in multifamily housing loans just last year. No strings attached. Let's attach some strings. If you want that money, if you want to get the federal financing, you can't evict people for complaining to the Board of Health. You've got to control your rent increases, make them consistent with inflation. You need to make sure that they can organize or be allowed to do that and not going to kick them out because of poor housing conditions. So we can do that by having rent control. So those are the 3 short-term answers. The long-term answers are, number 1, we need to change how we think about housing. In the United States, at least the policy approach, if you look at the funding, if you look at the tax policy, we treat housing as a commodity. We treat it as a wealth-building commodity, frankly, for the already wealthy. And so we need to change that, but the good news is we don't need to change our philosophy. Because if you look and see what the American people actually want, what we actually feel, we already see housing as a human right. So you see that I won't spend 4 students, I have to have 3 weeks talking about human rights and housing, right? But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, etc., all this international law saying housing is a human right, and the United States hasn't signed on to that, one of the very few countries that hasn't. But guess what? It all came from the U.S. It came from Franklin Delano Roosevelt saying that housing should be a human right. That's what led to the UN, led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have a U.S. origin, and it's not surprising because you look at the morality of this from religious and faith traditions. You look at the tradition, we see housing as a human right. It's important to say this didn't used to be this way. Before the 1980s, and I see some folks with similar hairlines to me or our white hair in this room, so you know, before the 1980s, we didn't have the kind of homeless population we're seeing. We didn't have teeming eviction courts every week. Why? Because we spent 5 times as much in subsidized housing. We treated it as a human right, de facto. And then something happened. So, I don't know if Pastor Darren's going to kick me out of the building for saying I'm going to speak ill of the dead here for a minute. But the saying goes in the homeless advocacy world is that every park bench and every underpass where an unhoused person is sleeping should have Ronald Reagan's name on it. Because that is what caused us to absolutely just gut our subsidized housing programs. And in defense of, not in defense of Ronald Reagan, but to spread the blame around, there's been plenty of folks from both parties have not restored it ever since. In all those 40-some years ever since. So we have, again, we didn't used to be this way in the United States and beyond. And the consensus is most people in this country believe that housing is a human right. Polling shows that. So it seems, well, boy, that'd be hard to do. You know, not so much. Because other nations are doing it right now. Other nations like ours are treating housing assistance as an entitlement, just like we do with food stamps, just like we do with Medicaid. If you're eligible, you receive it. And other places have far more government and subsidized housing, nice housing, safe housing, attractive housing in attractive locations. So you see the majority of people in places like Singapore and Vienna and other places, the majority of people are living in government housing and expanded renter rights. And how do they do this? I think the big picture is number 1 here on this bullet point. Far less rewards for wealthy landlords. Yeah. They don't make it so easy for Stephen Ross to make billions of dollars. They don't make it so easy for Donald Trump and other developers to make billions of dollars. So that's how we do. Number 1 is change our philosophy. Number 2 is real practically, we need to embrace public housing. And that might be a bit of a surprise coming from me. For a few of you in this room may know that our clinic has sued our local public housing agency several times because the conditions there have been very poor. They're not safe, they're not clean. It's really been substandard in a half dozen different ways that are too gross to talk about after you just ate. But it doesn't have to be this way again. We have had historically in the United States, and definitely still have in other nations, public social housing which is really strong. Why? Because it's been funded adequately. Because they do have security, because they do have maintenance. If you take any property, Lugar Tower downtown or any other one, and you just neglect it for 40 years, it's not going to look good. And when you neglect it and you don't have any security, then you're going to have necessarily some violence issues and some crime problems. So other nations show that we can do this. And the final long-term answer is universal housing assistance. We just need to recognize we've been so focused as a policy, again, not our hearts, but the policy of housing needs to be something where people build wealth. Recognize that for Angela at this time of her life, for their kids where they are, she can't afford market rate housing. For a lot of our clients, they live on disability incomes. They're never going to be able to afford market rate housing. Their total income is less than $1,000 a month. For those folks, we can't turn to the market for the answer. We need to understand that they need housing assistance, and we shouldn't be turning away 3 out of every 4 people who are eligible for it. So we can make housing assistance an entitlement, and other nations do, which of course leads to the question, how do we afford that? Because housing costs money. We're going to hear about that, I think, from our panel. Housing costs money. It's not easy to accomplish. How do we do that at the risk of being very blunt and advocacy-oriented? We already do it. We already spend more than enough money on housing subsidies in the United States to make sure that Angela and every other person we see in the picture, or every other client that we've ever had has housing. We're just subsidizing the wrong people. And we're subsidizing the wrong corporations, to be blunt about it. So that's an unsettled message. And I will say that on behalf of Angela, on behalf of all of our clients, on behalf of the hundreds of people who are going to be evicted this week in Marion County and the hundreds of people who are going to be evicted next week in Marion County, just in the tens of millions of people who are like them across the country, thank you for coming out on a Sunday. Thank you for being a part of this discussion and showing that you care, because we can go beyond caring. We can fix this crisis. So here are some resources, and I look forward to hearing about fixing the crisis from all the other collective wisdom this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Fran. I'm John Hamilton of Richard and Annalee family, along with my sister. We appreciate you all being here. Our spouses are here too, Don and Dave, and we really appreciate you being here. My job is to moderate the next part, so John, coming on up. David, thank you. I'll introduce our folks who you may not know as well in a moment, but let me first give you a quick, I'm going to join you right there, David, so hang up. I don't want to stand up here all the time. Quick agenda review here. We're going to have this panel talk a little bit about the issues they just heard and some other prompted questions. And then we're going to open it up for audience Q&A. So write down your questions, whether it's to Fran for his keynote or for the discussion that will follow. And we'll be having a roving mic after a little bit of this. So let me give a quick introduction to the three, and then we're going to jump right in. Fran Quigley, you just heard it. You don't need to introduce me. Thank you, Fran, for being here. John Edgar, many of you heard his introduction as well, who's been with us all weekend and preached today. Thank you, John, founding pastor, United Methodist Church for All People, and executive director of Community Development for All People. And then also joining us is David Bacon. David, thank you for being here. David is the CEO of Mapleton Fall Creek Development Center, also co-chair of Trinity Episcopal Church, Board Outreach Board, and Board President of Indiana Justice Project. And if y'all need to correct that or supplement it, you'll have your chance very shortly. But let's start. And I think I'm asked to do this in part because I was the mayor of Bloomington for 8 years, just finished last December, in which affordable housing is a huge issue for us too, as every community around the state and country and most of the world. So here's your first question, and then I'm going to sit down. Let's go in this order, okay? David first, and then John, because the first question is, what did you think of that keynote? Right? what parts of it struck you particularly important or interesting? Maybe were there any parts you wanted to add context to it? But let's first give the reaction. And Fran, you can have the last word if you want to say, I wish I had said this. Let's start with David. Thank you.
Well, first let me just ask this question. Can everyone hear me in the back? Okay, so I just want to make sure. I want to first say hello to my mom, who's back there. Say hi. Came home with I didn't say that it's not. So I just want to say hi, Mom. But at first, this is something we talk about at Trinity an awful lot. And I heard it today when I was at an excellent sermon earlier. But we talk about the God of abundance being real, and you look at what you just saw from Professor Quigley, and I tell people this all the time, but this is not a crisis that's not within our grasp to fix. This is a set of intentional policy choices that we have made over the course of the last 80 to 100 years. Some of you already since the founding of the country. And if you want to get really nerdy about it, since English common law became a thing in like the 15th century. But all of that is to say that because these are a set of policy choices that we've all made, collectively as a society, we're the powerful people who've had the vote, the people who've been in charge, we have to unmake them. We have to change the way that we make these decisions. We have to prioritize and center people instead of property, and the way we think about the human condition in this country. That's the first thing that struck me. The second thing that struck me is, I have been involved in housing at pretty much, I'm going to say almost every tier of it. I worked on Wall Street. I worked during the financial crisis. I represented hedge funds. I represented private equity groups. I probably represented Mr. Ross. I know that I represented JP Morgan. And I know what it's like to sit there and look at reams of mortgage numbers and securitized backed mortgages that no one, sitting in this office in Manhattan that looks over Times Square and not even thinking about the fact that these are people. They're just numbers. A mortgage is a number to me. And here I am now. I'm working as developing affordable housing, community development corporation. And I'm watching people come to my office almost every other day looking for housing, calling me. Do you have any units? Do you have any units available? And I'm like, I don't. I've got 10 that I have control over, and federal regulations from the money that we got to build, some of them say that I can't just take people in. They have to go on a waiting list, and they have to be this qualification, that qualification, all that kind of stuff. It's so, in between those times, I actually served as a clerk of court, well, not the clerk of court, but as a clerk in a small claims court, where I was responsible in part for maintaining the eviction docket for the court that represents this area of town, actually, Washington Township Small Claims Court. So I have seen firsthand what Professor Quigley was talking about when he says that the median person who comes into court is a mom and a child. Sometimes they bring a child with them because they don't have anywhere else to take them. And this is, I just want people to understand that all these small little, it's a small mortgage section here, it's a shared interest loophole over here, and you look at the people that you see on the streets, like, this is the result of these choices that we are making as a society. And we have got to do better. Politics flows downhill from culture, and I've become more convinced after the course of the last 5 years that we cannot change the culture of this country by changing the politics of it. We have got to change the culture of us as people, as Americans. If we want to improve the politics to get us to the place where we can make these choices and make them correct.
So again, I'm John Edgar, and I am recently retired from having launched 25 years ago a community development corporation on the south side of Columbus, Ohio. So I come from Ohio, not from Indiana. And even in retirement, I'm still doing a lot of stuff around affordable housing. So I would start by just affirming that the presentation you heard is really outstanding. And I mean, I'd be nice to you. And just to say, Fran did a great job of summarizing stuff that is absolutely true. It's been written about in many places.
Is eligible for it. You need to move some dollars around. You need to take some dollars away from Stephen Ross, right? You need to take some of the breaks away from the wealthiest folks, and you can stay in the housing arena. And that's where the money would come from. But I do think that is only a short-term answer, because universal housing assistance means folks are going to get vouchers. And to get vouchers, you've got to go out in the private sector, and you've got to find a good landlord to rent to you. And we won't go with a lot of stories here, but as anybody who's done this work knows, that's hard to do. It's very hard to do, to find a landlord who will take a voucher, who will be a responsible landlord. So you're stuck with the for-profit system still, even with vouchers. So long-term, we've got to build a lot more public housing. We've got to build a lot more what's called social housing, different ways that it is outside of the for-profit system, because the for-profit system has not served low-income people well. It doesn't serve low-income people well, so that's where some of the dollars need to go.
So I'll focus on the national level to give a grade, only because I don't live in Indianapolis or Indiana, so it would be pretty wrong for me to try to grade that. I would say at the national level, again, it's a failing grade. Maybe it's a type of a D. And what I mean by that is, as we were trying to find our way out of COVID, there were some federal policies that were enacted or highly recommended to states and municipalities that actually were a modest step in the right direction. I mean, we did some things. We made it really hard to evict people during the height of COVID. And so in a community like Columbus, basically, there were no evictions. I mean, there was a very narrow way in which people could still be evicted, but basically it stopped. We also then, as we were coming out of COVID, had money through the American Recovery Act that provided a whole lot of rent subsidy on a short-term basis. And that also then stabilized a bunch of folks. Now, all of that's ended, and so I'm not sure what that does, on the grade. If we were at one point at a D+, we're now at a D-, or pick the number. But I think it does speak to the fact that we do know there are ways to shift this that makes it better or worse. And then in terms of policy, at the risk of just being redundant, but I would want to keep the eye on the prize. The policy to change is that getting a housing voucher should just be declared an entitlement, just as was said, like food stamps or Medicaid. If you are income eligible, you should get the voucher. If we did that, if we did just that as a policy, it would dramatically change the entire game. And indirectly, it gets back to some of what Fran was saying, that before the 1980s, there were enough vouchers. It wasn't perfect, but it almost functioned as if everybody could get it. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it was much better. And if we do that, then we have to shift the money. Because if we make it the policy, how are we going to pay for it? And once more, I would suggest that what we want, if we could just snap our fingers, is, if necessary, stop the property tax exemption for homeowners, or make it a needs-based kind of thing, where it caps out pretty quickly if your income is way up above a certain place. We shift the money, we can fund Section 8 vouchers as an entitlement, and then the nation could get at least a C+ or maybe a C-.
Okay, so it falls to me to grade the city of Indianapolis. I suppose we've done the federal and the state. I actually give the city of Indianapolis a B-. And here's why, okay? Like, there's, as crazy as it's gonna sound, I talk to my colleagues in other states, and they have had to go through a lot more of a convincing process, struggling to get cities on board with the concept of housing first. And one thing I will say about this city and the Department of Metropolitan Development is they have adopted that and ran with it. Like, they really believe in it. They want to build more permanent supportive housing. They're trying to remove the barriers to make that happen. Part of that, I'm not just saying that because they give me funding to build stuff, but I'm just talking about philosophically. And this is, and like I said, I speak to a lot of other folks in California, Texas, Georgia, and I tell them stories about, people trying to give me money to do this, and they're like, I wish that I had that problem. On that front, we seem to have the philosophy in the right place, and that is a real struggle for a lot of people in a lot of other places. Now, as far as the way that, I know that it's difficult to say, like, well, with the rocket docket that we have on evictions here, that we're in a bad place. I would say that if you look at us compared to the collar counties around us, you want to spend some time, you really start to disparage about our prospects in the state, go out to Boone County, go out to Hamilton County, go out to Hancock. Go look at what evictions look like out there. At least we have people like you sitting there to watch what's going on. At least we have people who understand that this is a problem. At least we have a judiciary that understands that the public perception of the law and the court system and how that adds legitimacy to the way that we're governed as people is an issue. You don't see that everywhere. And I say that as someone who's practiced in other counties. Like, So, you know, I understand that everybody's frustrated with what they see, what they've heard about today, but I just want you to understand that, like, as bad as this appears to be, and it is bad, it could be so much worse. Like, you know, so my policy that I want to change, I'm going to piggyback off of, you know, some other comments here with Pastor Edgar said. I actually came up with this cockamamie scheme while I was sitting here and I was listening to both their answers. What I would do is take the mortgage interest deduction for each state to the extent that you can deduct your mortgage interest. And I would actually make it a sliding scale on which both relating to two things. Number one, the relative wealth and assets of the person who is seeking the mortgage interest reduction. And then the other one is the state policy on, you know, if your state has greater amounts of homeless people, and guess what? You get less mortgage interest deduction. Like, that's it. If you have a robust social net that provides rental assistance and prevents people from being on the street, prevents people from being homeless, then yeah, your tenants, the residents of your state, you get that full benefit. But like, unless we have some sort of accountability that kind of gives the states and the places that we are, you know, that gives state governments an incentive to step in and do the things that we all know that they can do to prevent this, is going to continue to happen. And I will say that like, you know, we've tried a lot of sticks with, you know, with some of these governments, state governments that feel like we don't have, you know, that have a different philosophy of the relationship between people and the government. Maybe we can start dangling some carrots and see if we can get somewhere. I'm at my wit's end, folks. Like, I want to try something different.
Okay. I'm going to do one more question, and then we're going to open it up for you all, so you think about that. But it is a two-part question this way, so we'll go back this way, you know, like we do on political debates and stuff. So David, you'll be first. So, and I want to follow up a little bit. I should note, Housing First is very real in the state. There are regions that are working hard. Bloomington is one of those. Indianapolis, you mentioned. It does make a difference. It does work. And local communities and organizations can really help with that. And Fran, just to follow up, yes, I first got into office in 2016, and one of the first things I wanted to do was pass inclusionary zoning in Bloomington. We have a lot of new construction in Bloomington, and the inclusionary zoning would let us say to a developer, if you're building 20 or more units or 10 or more units, you have to make 20% of them affordable, or give enough money to make them affordable somewhere else. As soon as we got word that we were moving forward, that the state legislature made it illegal to have inclusionary zoning anywhere in the state of Indiana. So the good part of that is, instead, we figured out, okay, what we'll do instead is say you can only have a building X high anywhere in the city, but if you put in affordable housing and green housing, you can go to X plus 2 stories, X plus 3 stories. They wanted to get rid of that, but they couldn't figure out how to do it without making everybody else feel so upset about zoning control. So there are ways around it. But here's your question. And some of this follows up, David, the part I'm adding is from what you referenced about culture. This being this whole gathering is thinking about theology and community and contemporary issues. So one, how do we move culture on this? How do you think that happens? If you have a suggestion about that, whether it's faith communities or others. And then the specific question, and some of you have suggested this already, but you can get more controversial or specific if you want about what we should do with our own zoning codes or anything. But locally, if you got to whisper in each person's ear here, I wish you would do this or support this, even though it may feel difficult or you're not sure, but I wish you would do this with yourself. And the only thing you whispered in their ear, but you do it into the mic. Okay.
Hard. Well, those are two pretty big questions. You know, obviously, you know, I talked about changing culture, and you this is a big question. I was a sociology major by an undergrad, and so this is a question while challenging, I kind of love. And I know that culture doesn't happen at mass levels, right? It happens in small groups. Small groups. So I think one of the things that we need to do is to maybe start talking to our neighbors, start talking with small groups of people that we know that we've never had discussions about, well, what do you think about homelessness? Or, your friend who comments about, this guy, this homeless person threw a cup of coffee at my car and I got really pissed off. I hate him so much. Let's talk about that. Difficult conversations, maybe just easy conversations, but begin to talk about the outcomes that we want to change. Why things are the way that they are. What can we do about it? But we have to start on these small groups, these small levels. I know that TAB has this great program called Circles, which I find fascinating, where they have small groups of folks, and I'm not sure exactly how it works. Tabernacle Presbyterian Church on the corner of 34th and Central. But they get small groups of folks together to talk about the issues that they face across class lines and talk to one another about finding solutions, and then sometimes just listening about, and the thing is that we have to engender a culture of caring about one another that would make it reprehensible for us to see people on the street suffering. And the way that we do that is by getting people to care about one another again. Not just people you know, but people that you don't know. And then this policy question, that's a really tough one. And I got to do it for the city here. The policy question.
What do you want them to do?
Let's see. I want to see us as a state become much more. I want to take the attitude that the city of Indianapolis has and kind of multiply it across the state. We just need more housing, period. We need obviously more affordable housing. I'm not saying that because I'm going to take that money to build more affordable housing, which I would do, obviously. But we are at an inflection point right now in the state of Indiana and the state of Indianapolis. I know that the elephant in the room is that a lot of people who are sitting here realize that you go downtown, you in the last 12 months you've noticed an uptick in the amount of people you've seen on the street, right? The reason why that's happened is because, and this is based on just a formula, there's a great book out there called Homelessness is a Housing Problem. Rabbi Ernest Spiegel back there, he's got a copy of it if you want to hold it up. But it's a book that's been written by a former investment banker who did essentially the investment case for why homelessness happens. And it turns out that there's an actual formula that you can figure out when you're going to start seeing people on the street. And we have dipped below that. He said we were on the cusp of it, and then 12 months later, almost 12 months now, almost 12 months to the day, I can say that he was right. He said, you were right on the cusp of starting to see more homeless people on the streets here, and I definitely noticed it. I don't know if you all do, but it's just true. And so I guess the thing that I would say is, and this is the solution that he recommends, is building more housing of all types at all levels, especially affordable, but it doesn't always just have to be affordable. Building more market rate helps. Building expensive houses can help too at some points. But it takes everyone has got to pitch in and do their part by supporting policies at the local level that encourage building, by not complaining when people start to build apartment buildings down the street from you, by supporting churches trying to build affordable housing on land that they own. All of it. This is a we problem. It is not just me. It's just not just you. It's all of us.
So I'd like to build on what you already said about how do you shift culture. I become increasingly convinced that we change attitudes when we interact with people that are different from us in positive settings. And so I think it becomes a matter of how do we create environments, opportunities to have ongoing interactions with people who are different. And in this way, to the degree that most of us are middle-class folks, how do we interact more often and at a deeper level with people who are low income? You know, in the literature, they talk about this notion called social capital. It just is when you hang out with other people, you build relationships and it generates social capital. But there are two kinds. There's what's known as bonding social capital, which is when all the Irish folks hang out at the same Irish club. You know, and it's not wrong, but you know, you're just getting to know it. Or wealthy people all hang out at the same country club. But there's also bridging social capital, and that's a concept of bringing people together who are different, but in positive settings. And as you build relationships, everybody's impacted and empathy grows. And there's a further concept called third place, where the notion is that the first place in our life is where we live, second place is where you go to work, go to school, but third place is where you hang out when you're not at home and not at work. And third places that are designed to generate bridging social capital are how we change culture. And so the group that I worked on 25 years, it's not what I talk about today, we have spent a lot of time simply in our community trying to create third places whose sole purpose is to generate bridging social capital. And so we operate a bike shop and an art gallery and a coffee shop, all because we want to bring diverse people together to have positive interaction. So I think, you know, it's playing the long game, but I think it's, you know, what can work. Then, if I could whisper in people's ears, I thought about that. I'm going to cheat because I want to whisper two different things in different ears. For those of you who are members of North Church, I would whisper in your ear, lean in and encourage your pastor and other key leaders who are dreaming a bold dream about how to develop some of your own land as affordable housing. It's worth doing, and it would be an incredible witness. And so I would urge you to commit to supporting them and be willing to risk not the church finances, but your own pocketbooks to a little degree to pull it off. You know? And for those of you who aren't part of North Church, to me it's the parallel. I would encourage you to think of where you can invest dollars in what sometimes generically is called short-term, shallow subsidy. And what it means is you raise money, and I'll give you one illustration. Columbus State is a commuter school where most of the students are low income. And they have high dropout rates because people lose their housing while they're doing their academic work. So they created a program for short-term, shallow rent subsidy. In other words, they subsidize their own students to have stable housing. Because housing first, that Fran has talked about, is right. If we stabilize people's housing, they can do almost anything, including first-generation college students who are never going to make it through that community college if they don't have stable housing. So it's just an illustration, but I would invite you to invest your money. And in North Church, invest in your own land and believe that you can find the leaders and the means to do it. And anybody else, I really encourage you to listen around. Where's an opportunity, whether it's housing pregnant women, transitional youth, which are all things I've been involved in one way or another, or at-risk college students. But short-term, shallow means, doesn't have to be the whole rent, which is part of it, and focused on a near-term goal so that when the person reaches that goal, the subsidy goes away.
Well, those are all terrific. I want to say ditto to everything that David and John said. Just to add a couple of things. One is how we move the culture. I think the first thing we need to do is see the injustice. Those of us who live with the privilege need to see the injustice. That's why, when you have the abstraction of capital gains, tax avoidance, and carried interest loophole, which David shouted out. I think David could do that slide better than I'm going to. But you need to come talk to the class because my tax law expertise runs out at some point. But that's all so abstract. And I think that ends up, we talk about the mortgage interest deduction. Why? Because we understand that, because we've benefited from that. But that, frankly, is pennies compared to what the Stephen Rosses of the world are getting. And so it's all abstract. How do we get out of that abstraction? And I think that's where what the work of the Eviction Justice Network is doing. Folks are going to court and they're seeing that. And when you see injustice, when you witness injustice, and I think they've proven it, Carolyn and Aaron and others have proven it, they want to take steps to remedy it. It's just being there and seeing this horror show that is eviction court. Is that alone fixing the problem? It's not, but it's motivating people like us who are pretty insulated from the suffering to actually see it and then take the steps to evict. So that would be the way I think the culture changes. The culture changes by us, frankly, getting out of the abstraction, the very intentionally created abstraction, so that we don't see the struggle and the suffering and the injustice and the subsidies going where they go, and actually seeing the struggle and then taking the action. In terms of whispering, to go to keep on the same theme, I would just take what Carol said to start off this afternoon and whisper that again, or maybe just replay what she said in terms of supporting rent escrow and getting some kind of remedy for individuals, tenants living with very poor conditions here. We have a client right now. A student talked with her 3 days ago because her 6-year-old daughter woke up with bugs crawling over her face. Bed bugs, roaches, rodents, mold, stove and appliances not working, etc. But I'll tell you that if she doesn't pay her rent, that most judges in the state of Indiana are going to evict her. It doesn't matter how bad the conditions are. She's done everything right. She's contacted the landlord. She's contacted the health department. But what she told the student was, I'm a bad mother because I can't stop this from happening to my daughter. And we're one of 5 states in the country. Again, other places aren't perfect, but Ohio has a rent escrow law. Other places have a law that allows tenants to make that step. So I would just repeat what Carol says. Is that going to fix everything? No, but it starts the process of building momentum, building the awareness. Then people start being more supportive of more money for affordable housing, etc. So that would be my response.
Thank you very much. So I have more questions, but as long as you ask them, you don't have to hear me ask them. So we're going to come out to you. Darren has a microphone, I think. Okay. I'm going to read them. Oh, that's exciting. Are they in order? Okay. I do want to follow up, and this is pertaining to stewardship time as well. There's a phrase I like, which is there's too much money in our politics, but there's not enough politics in our money. If you replace politics with values, not enough values in our money and choosing what we do with our money. So that's good for your church and it's good for your community too. So, all right, here we go. Number 1, and it's to everybody, I guess, unless we see differently. Why is there opposition to affordable housing and renters' rights in the Indiana General Assembly? Why? John, you don't have to answer that. You want me to? No.
I got some answers. I mean, everyone in America are temporarily embarrassed millionaires. No one wants to admit that they're poor. And everybody wants to say, I don't want the poor people near me. Meanwhile, if you look at your own income, and you look at it, you say, oh, wait a minute, I'm barely making it. And so what happens is the legislature exploits that sort of feeling so that it can align with capitalists, Indiana Apartment Association, special interests, whatever you want to call it, to keep the laws the same way. So it's just kind of this whole cyclical, told you about sociology major. So this whole cycle of right, and it all stems from like the uniquely American thing of none of us wanting to admit that we are financially struggling. That we have a disdain for poverty and poor people because we don't want to admit that we ourselves have been or are poor. And what happens is the forces of money come in and they exploit that and say, well, you don't want to live near those people, do you? Like, oh, you want to punish the people who don't pay rent. You don't realize that you're only like 2 missed paychecks away from not being able to deal with those people. Homelessness in Indiana looks very different out of rural places. It's people couch surfing, it's people sleeping in cars at hospitals. And, so it becomes much more invisible to people who don't live in urban areas. And they don't think about themselves, their aunt that sleeps in a car at the hospital after her shift, They don't think of that as homelessness. You have a home, you sleep on my couch. No, you don't. Like, you are homeless. And so that's part of it. What was the opposition?
To housing and renters' rights. Affordable housing.
And then so the other thing is, with renters' rights, I would say that, I heard, and this is not, I do not think it's accurate, or I don't know if it's accurate, but I've heard that a lot of members of the Indiana General Assembly are themselves landlords. I think it's, the number I heard was like somewhere between 50 and 80%. So part of the conceptual thing that we're talking about here is a bunch of landlords who do not want to give tenants rights. And then, you know, I mean, just straight up. And, you know, I don't know if it's like them just not wanting, you know, wanting to be able to get that, you know, additional funding from, you know, for their campaigns from those at the, you know, at private equity or what. Or if it's just them simply saying, listen, I'm a landlord. I would never evict some, you know, I take care of my properties. I would never evict somebody, so why would I do that then? They think of the median landlord as, you know, an older retired person who just has a property to generate, you know, income in retirement, instead of these mega, you know, private equity groups, hedge fund groups that are the actual landlords. So, you know, the cynical person will say, well, it's because they don't want to give their own tenants more rights. The more optimistic person would maybe say that, you know, like maybe they just don't realize it. But, you know, I'm starting to fall on the cynical spectrum because I know that Jima and Rabbi Aaron Spiegel and all these folks out here who are doing the launching are talking to the General Assembly and you know, presenting this information. And so I know that they have it. They just, at this point, like, I have to believe what you know, like, or what your record says you want. You know the information now and you're continuing to pass on it. So I have to think that this is intentional. And, you know, I don't know what to say about that.
Ditto to what David said. Bill Grothier is an attorney, and a lot of you if you put North Parishioner, you know Bill already. Bill has been the attorney many times for Common Cause of Indiana. Common Cause of Indiana's executive director, Julia Vaughn, starts off many of her speeches with something I really appreciate. She says that campaign finance may not be your most important issue, but it has to be your first issue. Because what we have is Indiana Apartment Association, as David said, frankly, the private for-profit real estate companies that are benefiting from the current situation are the most powerful lobbying and campaign contributing force in the state of Indiana. They are the 400-pound monster in there that actually controls what happens, and legislators will not cross them to the point where, you know, Aaron and others have been working so hard, and I think they're going to win, but it's not an easy fight, and it's not an easy fight because Angela doesn't contribute to their campaigns, right? Angela can't hire a lobbyist. And all the other, you know, thousands and thousands of people across the country, across the state, including folks in the rural communities, they're not lobbying, but the apartment associations and the folks who are making money off the current dysfunctional system, it's not dysfunctional for them, they're there. And they're there, and they're giving checks, and they're showing up with high-paid lobbyists who used to be golf buddies with the legislator or law partners with the legislator. And they're winning. They're definitely winning.
I'll just add, since I'm out of office too, the two words, I guess, I do think the values of legislators can make a difference, and their values can come from their own experience, their work, their other things, but ultimately the most important word is power, and legislators recognize power and respond to it, which is very often reflected in money, because they all depend upon money. Ultimately, it does depend upon the power of votes, because if they don't get enough votes, that is ultimately the most responsive, and being able to connect votes to power to make things happen is difficult, very difficult, but ultimately one approach. And then the other word I would just say, and David, you talked about this in our history and others, is race. I do think there's a legacy of race in the policies of Indiana that are very difficult to address and get hold of. All right, John, you're going to be involved in this one because this is something, right? So, speak on private equity being in housing. Why not outlaw this? At least have to live in the state to do that. So there's legal questions about that. But do you have any comments about kind of private investors, outside investors, Wall Street, private equity that's getting more involved in housing?
First of all, it is a real problem that seems to be getting worse, particularly in some markets such as Indianapolis, several parts of Ohio, because from the outside, I think maybe you made reference to this before, if you live in California or New York and you've got a lot of money to invest, it looks really advantageous to swoop into some of these markets in our part of the country where it's easy to acquire property. I mean, it's just not as expensive, you know. And so there's a lot of money that is starting to flood in. And there have been some efforts in Central Ohio and even in the Ohio General Assembly. They haven't gone very far, but saying, what could we do to slow those folks down, to make it harder for them, these hedge funds, to buy property and to hold it, perhaps having some laws or restraints directly related to people that own more than X number of apartment units. I haven't seen that result in any meaningful corrections at this point, but it is an issue. There's no question about that. And then I would also just acknowledge that at least in Central Ohio, so many of the folks that have developed multifamily apartment buildings and continue to own them are actually homegrown developers. Yeah. And so it's a mix. We do have folks coming in from outside. In parts of Ohio, some of those outside groups are actually buying up enormous numbers of single-family homes, not apartment buildings, and then really manipulating the home ownership market as a result of that. So it's a mixed challenge, and sadly, I think we're going to see more of the negative impact of that, at least for a while, because we have such an increasing concentration of wealth in a shrinking part of the total population. So you have a lot of really rich people trying to figure out what to do with their money, and who are giving serious consideration to just buying apartments.
Anyone else? Sure. Well, the United States Supreme Court has left a few constitutional provisions intact, and one of them is that you can't outlaw out-of-state purchasers. We've tried, folks have proposed that. You can't just pass a law saying you ain't from here, you can't buy a house. But there are two, they're here for a reason. We mentioned that earlier. We have so much, and again, to John's point, we have an awful lot of purchasing going on in single-family housing. And that is not just oftentimes really poor quality rental housing, but it's keeping other people out of the home buying market where they can't afford it. Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana has a terrific report out there that's on their website about that, specifically what's happening in our community. But they're here because we make it easy, right? And so, and David was good enough to outline some carrots to how to incentivize better behavior. We can do sticks too, right? And we can't prevent private equity, hedge funds, etc. from purchasing real estate. But we can have taxes where if this is a certain level of purchase, there's going to be extra taxes you have to pay. And those taxes, that tax revenue can go towards affordable housing, can actually towards the things that David wants to do. We can have an increased tax if you flip a home. If you're going to own the home for less than a year, less than 2 years, we can tax that. We can tax the negative behavior. We can absolutely tax poor housing conditions, right? We need to have that provided. And also, and I think that John already mentioned inclusionary zoning, right? Inclusionary zoning that we can actually say that if you want to develop housing in this community, then you're going to have to make sure you have some affordable housing as part of it. So there are some sticks that we can do. We can't set up a wall. I know we like walls in the United States right now, apparently. We can't set up a wall around the state of Indiana and say, none of this out-of-state money can come in. Unfortunately, that's not allowed. But we can do things to make it a little bit less of a welcoming playground to private equity and hedge funds to trample on tenants' rights.
As the only person I think up here who does represent private equity, I would say that when I heard that question, I was like, it's pretty easy to dance around that. You just have the private equity company just start a corporate entity that's based in the state and just get around it, right? So I think the only way to actually do this is, and this is going to Mr. Quigley said, we have to stop the ability of, the only way we can make those properties less valuable to own, to the point where private equity says, you know, this is a bad investment, we don't want to do it anymore, is to make it harder to evict people. Because that's the thing that's attracting all of them like a magnet to this place, because the minute that they know that they can evict someone, have them out in like 20 days, and then you don't even have to fix the moldy ceiling, like you just put someone right back in, so it becomes a revenue generating unit right away. And the way that they conceptualize and think about this, they have these giant financial models, these giant spreadsheets, and they look at these units as numbers, and they say like, okay, how quickly can you turn that person who didn't pay their rent back into a rent paying unit? Like how long? How long is it going to take? Is it going to take 10 days? Is it going to take 20 days? Is it going to take like 4 months? Because that's what, and that's why this is so important. This is how this all ties in together. You know, like you know, we've got young people out here who have money to buy homes and can't buy them. Young families. We've got a court system where the wheels are greased to allow people to just be able to push them out. And there's a connection between those two. We cannot stop that from happening. I'm increasingly convinced the only way this is going to happen really is to make evicting people more difficult. Because that's the only thing that changes the calculus on that gigantic spreadsheet of all of, with the mortgage, with the delta between the mortgage and how much you're paying in rent and how long, like if you make that formula like not work anymore because every 4 months they evict somebody because they didn't fix the place up, like they lose out like for 3 months of rent, that's the only way that disrupts the formula and says, you know what, we got to sell this stuff. Like this is no longer viable. It's not viable. It's just
Great, thank you. We've got one question that I'm going to read to you. I think you kind of touched on it already, but I'm one of many in the room who wants to know how to help on housing, but don't yet know how. What's your advice on figuring out our way to contribute to this cause? I think you talked about that. If you want to add that a bit more. Fran and David, I'm going to give you a quick question on this, just 30 seconds, 45 seconds each, and then we'll have a closer. For Fran and David, why doesn't the Indianapolis Housing Agency work well? What is their problem? Just talk about what you think there's something they can do. I mean, I know.
Oh my gosh. So as a person involved in active litigation against the Indianapolis Housing Agency, I will say it does circle back to the macro issue. This is an incredibly underfunded agency. And now, have there been bad management and bad decisions? Absolutely, but it does not have the resources to fix the problems they have. It's so important because it also administers the voucher programs, not just the housing programs. And you see folks in the community involved in housing saying the core of a functional housing system has to be a strong local housing agency. And we don't have it. We haven't had it for decades, and we don't have it now. HUD has come in, and folks don't know the federal government has come in and taken over our housing agency, but they don't have any more money than they had before, and so they can't fix everything that needs to be fixed. Well, I take it back because I'm trying to get a judge to say yes, they can. But let me say, it's hard for them to fix everything that needs to be fixed. It's hard for them to have adequate security. They've got some buildings in amazing locations, building with great bones, downtown buildings, but they have been allowed to be in enormous neglect because of underfunding. And again, this circles back to David's point. The reason public housing in the United States has always been problematic is because it's been intentionally funded because guess who was lobbying Congress from day one? The private real estate market. Because they don't want there to be, understandably, a really thriving public housing system in the United States of America, that's taking money out of their pockets. So there are not enough resources, not enough resources.
We need to leave you 11 seconds.
I'm sorry.
Well, that's okay. I don't have much to add other than just to say that the way that the IHA affects me is that they're supposed to pay some of the rent for a portion of the rent for some of my tenants, and it's always late. How are you always late? You're the state. Come on, they have plenty of money. So I understand the dysfunction. I understand the frustration. But what I also understand is working with my colleagues in the city and seeing the difficulty they have every day. They're underpaid, understaffed, and overworked, every single one of them. And so while you are correct that we have some people who made some terrible decisions in the past and we're still paying for, I know that there are people in a lot of these agencies who are doing the best they can with the limited resources and time they've got. And so, I hold my heart out to them because a lot of them really do care about the city and they care about the people who they serve. But there's just, it's a capacity issue. They just don't have the money and they don't have the people.
Thank you. We're going to have a last bit. We'll start down with Fran, work this way, and then Darren has a 20-minute closing at 8:20. Good job, very shortly. If you do want to address more advice, you're welcome to do that as you do this. But I used to say you could talk about housing, affordable housing. There's two main ways to do it. Have more of it, more supply, or subsidize it, make it less expensive through some way. And we've talked a lot about both of those, but I do want to just ask you to think about, I bet some of us in this room are in neighborhoods that don't welcome change. In Indianapolis, probably, in this area, we have neighborhoods that are zoned to protect the interests of those who live there, both racially and originally, but also economically. How do we think about that? Loosening up, how do we help loosen that up, make more supply happen, help? Density is sometimes a hot word in areas, but if you get more supply, you probably need more density. So let's talk about supply, and then if you have any final comments, you got just about a minute each, but let's go down to Fran and work our way this way.
I used up more than my time last time, and the supply folks are sitting to my left, so I'm going to let them address the supply because it's so important. But again, the supply isn't enough. It's got to be affordable supply, right? You can build more market rate housing. Angela can't afford market rate housing. They're already living in some pretty sketchy places for $800 a month, and they can't afford $800 a month, so it has to be subsidized and has to be lower rent. And both John and David work on that, so I'll let them talk.
So most of the work that I've done has been on the supply side, but rather than reiterate that, I just want to focus on a couple things. One, right now Columbus has a very progressive municipal government, mayor and city council, on some of these supply issues. So the city is dramatically rewriting its zoning code to promote more density as a way of trying to get to more supply. So for example, in certain corridors and gradually through the whole city, there are no longer parking requirements of any kind. It's just, parking will be market driven exclusively. You can build anything you want and have as few parking units as you want, and it'll promote density. They're also getting ready right now to pass the new zoning rules on what are called ADU or auxiliary dwelling units. In essence, it allows a second structure to be built on your residential property. It can be a carriage house where you had a garage, various things. But these are tools to create, to use the land more effectively. And then, along with inclusionary zoning, Columbus is saying you can build higher if you have more affordability. If you have less affordability, you can't go as high. So they're trying a variety of things there. The one other thing that I would mention, though, and I'll finish with this whole notion of NIMBY, not my backyard. And it's something that we encountered from the very beginning when we started developing housing 20 years ago. So about 8 years ago, we decided to try something additional and play the long game. And we now operate every year a 9-month Neighborhood Leadership Academy, where we train 20, 25 neighborhood folks to become leaders who then populate the civic associations, what we call area commissions. And we invite these people to embrace some of the same notions we've been talking about in this book I wrote. It's the same stuff at the beginning of that book. And say we can build from the neighborhood level up a sustainable mixed income community. But we can only do that if we advocate for that diversity. And so we now can get nearly unanimous votes at the civic association level saying, yes, bring in that permanent supportive housing or that multifamily low-income housing development. And we just decided that we had to change the whole dynamic. And so we do this extensive process trying to bring middle class and low-income people together around some common principles and trying to build a neighborhood that rejects the NIMBY principle.
So, I'm going to talk a little bit directly about what we're doing, mostly because we actually are about to start building some stuff. We actually have 5 duplexes we're building between 28th and 29th on Rocco. We have a 57-unit permanent supportive housing and 50% area median income, 80% area median income building that's going to be built between 28th and 29th. It's going to be closing and groundbreaking in the first quarter of 2025 after many delays. We also have some blocks of land just north of there that we own. We own the old Unlimited Bread Cafe, and then we're also trying to examine what it would look like if we developed some land in conjunction with North United Methodist right now. So things are kind of cooking. We got some stuff on the low simmer. Hopefully we can come to a boil very soon. But for what people who want to be involved, I mean, I'm going to give you the really difficult thing, which is like start showing up at the city council meetings and stuff about zoning, like to advocate for more inclusive zoning, because so many times the people who really care a lot about it are people who don't want to change it. They like their little neighborhood. They bought their house 30 years ago because there was always going to be this preserved in amber to always be the way it is. And we need folks, especially folks with gray hair, to come in and say, you know what, I want more people in my neighborhood. I want more housing in my neighborhood. I want affordable housing in my neighborhood. It really helps a lot. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of a hard sell here. We at Maple Fall Creek Development Corporation are a nonprofit. And if you donate to us, we are in the process of building all of this wonderful stuff, but we don't have a whole lot of money for operations, so anything that you would be able to contribute to us, or you're more than welcome to talk to me about this, but like if you want to make a direct contribution, it would go directly to some of our building projects and the folks that are working on it, like myself, my construction manager, and create a little bit of a fund so that we can avoid folks coming to us and saying, I don't have enough money to pay my rent. We don't evict people like that, like that you've seen, but there are costs associated with that, and like anything you can give us to offset the costs that we have to make sure that we're not just throwing people out of the street would be great. And so that's why I did a direct and selfish plug.
Thank you. Would you please join me in thanking these 3?
A special word of thanks for what made this possible, for underwriting this, which is the William E. Schmidt Foundation, and Nick and Susan Blankenbaker Noyes and the Blankenbaker family. Without their generosity, none of this would have been possible. So let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you, folks, for coming. And if you've not been impressed about the housing crisis, tomorrow night at 6:30 we'll be having a forum on the Department of Child Services, the problem with these